Welcome to The Chat. Come behind the inbound scenes of some of the world's fastest growing companies. For the past 10 years as Chatmetrics, we've had an exclusive inside view of how these industry leaders are revolutionising inbound marketing and sales across diverse sectors. Each week, we bring you conversations with top minds in marketing and sales who share insider secrets and strategies for driving inbound success. Join us on The Chat, your front row seat to the future of inbound. Today, we're thrilled to welcome a true innovator in the marketing world, Ellza Malok. As the founder and chair of the Blue Monarch Group, Ellza has built a powerhouse agency that combines psychology and data science to craft marketing strategies that truly resonate. The journey from Kosovo to becoming an award-winning leader in global marketing is nothing short of inspiring. Known for her Alice in Wonderland curiosity, which we'll dig in a little bit later on, Ellza is unafraid to go down the rabbit holes in her research, redefining what it means to connect with audiences on a meeting level. Stay tuned for an inside look to the mind of a trailblazer, changing the game in modern marketing. Ellza, we will definitely get onto the question about the training that the CIA does in terms of speed to lead and speed to responses in particular. But you've been described as someone with an Alice in Wonderland curiosity, constantly exploring your rabbit holes in psychology and data to drive your marketing strategies. What's the most unexpected insight you've uncovered down one of those rabbit holes that's transformed the way you think about connecting with audiences?
Terry, thank you so much for having me on. It's a delight to kind of sit and chat with you about it. There's so many unexpected gems that you kind of find when you put research first. My entire workplace offers were found from that. Elements around how do we drive further improvement on user experience beyond the general UX psychology models. So it kind of goes, and the funniest one I guess I have is, helping an organization re-recruit a different personality and then realizing they were recruiting a very wrong type of personality that was much more givers than takers.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes even borderline sociopathic tendencies in the recruiting models without even understanding it. So there's so many of these nuggets, and that's why I think that curiosity first is something I live up to. In fact, I was so curious that everyone used to tell me, curiosity killed the cat. And then I actually looked up the whole quote and realized the rest of it is insatisfaction brought it back. So that whole 9 lives thing apparently works really well for curious cats.
Look, I think research as well is one of those things that any good marketer really needs to do at the front end, because it's the research and understanding the market and understanding the product that allows you to effectively deliver messaging and get the outcome that you're looking for with marketing, which is really about brand awareness and the ultimate goal of increasing sales.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think even when you go into, and it takes a certain level of reduction in ego, I think, for you to say, I'm going to go research because I don't know. Especially the more seasoned you become as a marketer, that there's a level of empathy around, let me go understand something that may have changed, may have been different. So I do think that there's a little bit of that. And knowing that research is probably going to play a stronger role because the acceleration to change has gotten rapid year over year, quarter over quarter, week over week sometimes, is so critical to our process.
You just mentioned there empathy and ego in the same sentence. It's like it doesn't happen very often, but I think you've absolutely nailed it when it comes to research. One of the biggest barriers can be ego, and that I already know. I think I know through my life's experiences, I know already. And yet that it's really that empathy to take those steps that uncovers the little insights or the little nuggets, the little unique mechanisms or particular little components along the way that can just make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And I think the marketing roles are going to be significantly more empathy driven. And this is more of a trend that I'm seeing than they have been ego driven. We come from that, look how amazing this company is, look what they can do, to the end of, to more of that pain point based model of, here's how we can help you, and here's some stories of people just like you. And I'm not even conversing on the consumer side, but the B2B side,
Mm.
probably even more so in that process. So um, what has traditionally worked may not work because buyer intelligence is at an all-time high, and it's going to continue to be so. There's more information available to any type of buyer than there has been in human history.
Absolutely. Look, I sort of coin it as other-centered versus self-centered. And when you're other-centered, then you just have a completely different focus on your messaging. And we found it out in the early days when we were starting our email outreach, for instance. It wasn't so much that we were completely self-centered, but we were talking a lot more about what we can do for you as opposed to what you need help with, and others that aren't necessarily doing it as well. It shows there might be an opportunity for you, phrasing the whole messaging to be from their perspective as opposed to ours. Let's jump on to the big question that's in my mind. You and I spoke, well, a couple of years ago almost now, and I mentioned that there's a statistic about speed to lead, and that we've discovered it now over the last decade of doing live chat. And there's been research that's done as well that shows that over 50% of winnable deals in B2B go to the organisation that responds to the inbound lead first. And I remember your eyes lighting up when you said that. Now, that reminds me about the CIA. Please tell me that story about the CIA. I'm fascinated to think that going from a business to business research and study that we know works and that we've seen work ourselves in terms of timing of response, how does the CIA come up with a similar sort of thing, or believe in the same philosophy?
So the story actually originally started when I was an analyst, and I was reporting up to the VP of sales, who has a military and intelligence background. And his whole comment around, leading sales was, whoever spoke first spoke best. It took me about a decade to get what that really meant from an intelligence standpoint. But that first mover advantage automatically plants the seed in your buyer's mind, in anybody's mind. You can use this beyond sales. You can use it anywhere, really. You're planting the seed that will continue to fester and nurture, that even when a counteracting evidence comes to play, it's harder for that seed to go away, or that particular notion, because it's on a neuroscience level. It's that facts action. There's kind of a dopamine hit that the receiver gets from that. And then it's frankly, like, once you get a lot of other responses, as we know, when buyers identify their 3 to 5 potential vendors or service providers that they want to use, the others start to kind of become cognitive overload a little bit, because then everybody starts to roll in around it. But I heard that then. And then as I was doing psychology research, I was like, oh, this makes sense why that was such an element of how intrinsic it was to the sales process that we organized. And I was in the analytics role at the time. So just kind of measuring those, and a lot of it was those time-based analytics that I was asked to do. And I'm like, I wonder why this is such a big point. And then a few years ago, and I can't remember the speaker's name, but he also came from an intelligence background, and he mentioned that this is part of the intelligence training that a lot of those go. And we know that, CIA does a ton of psychological intelligence throughout the process. So it was, those pieces of the puzzle started to make much more sense as I was doing my psychology research for BMG. And that was probably one of the first nugget of ahas that I had, because I went through a journey of about a year of just investigative research before actually doing pilots and going through the process. And it was just such a wow, that's interesting. I wonder what else is in, that Rolodex of nuggets that I can go in. So that's really how that whoever spoke first spoke best mentality. And transparently, you see this everywhere. You see this in politics, you see this in PR, you see this in so many of these. Everyone says we've got to get a message ahead of the problem. Because if you get it ahead, you technically spoke first, and it's a psychological trigger to be perceived at least as more believable and more trustworthy. Whether or not that's the case is a different question.
It was fascinating for me to watch from Australia this whole election process that's been going on. And I'm not going to get into politics here, but in particular, I saw it was almost a behind the scenes documentary snippet of how Trump was watching a Kamala speech. And he and his team were sitting there taking snippets out of that and putting them into Twitter, like as they're being
In
said,
real
within
time.
seconds of them being said in real time. It was fascinating. And all I could keep thinking back was, you know what? People are watching this. He is now being the first to speak in response to these statements that are being made. And he is having a more of an impact on framing the conversation, I feel, than what the person actually, regardless of who it was, when you're in that environment, the person that's responding like that and commenting and putting a frame around those particular words that the presenter is saying, I think they're having a bigger impact on the message that's being delivered than the person that's actually presenting. It was fascinating to watch.
Absolutely. And even in that medium, it's such an interesting way to do it because it's also an inherently easy way for, in this case, his buyers to absorb the information. We all remember the Twitter watch parties that we do on TV. This is the equivalent of that. It's just on a political side. It's not, you know, West Wing or whatever shows your flavor of
Mm.
it. For it, that is what occurs and transpires. So it's kind of that coupling of whoever spoke first, that first mover advantage with a medium that is already inherently a pattern in a particular group of people. So it kind of makes a ton of sense. And that goes back to, regardless of whatever party you align with, it goes back to like having specific tactics of the message is definitely important. The vehicle in which you deliver the message is just as important. And then how you roll that out. You can't, sometimes it helps to go, guns blazing, shoot the runway, let's move. Other times you have to pace yourself because the path to adoption of just that idea, that concept is far greater. A lot of my work is in tech and life sciences. So before I even started BMG, it was a lot of, how do we introduce this particular therapy into the market? How do we introduce this particular technology into the market? So that's one of the reasons why that method just ended up working so well, is methodology and vehicle to get that kind of level of success.
If you think about it from a buyer's perspective and back to product now, away from politics, normally when somebody's putting an inquiry in, they've already done some research. They have a kernel of knowledge in their mind, certainly about the problem that they're trying to solve. But by the time they're reaching out to an organisation, they also have a kernel of knowledge about that information, about that business itself. When we go through the learning process, the bigger that kernel gets, the easier it is to slot in new pieces of information. I think once you're at that stage where you're reaching out about an organisation, they already have an understanding. The impact that a speedy response has, and a response that isn't just, hello, how are you? It's actually responding to their inquiries, entering into a conversation. The knowledge about that particular component grows very quickly and exponentially during that conversation. And I think further to your point before about messaging overload as the others start to come in, this is how you get the opportunity to build the framework, because you've got the buyer's got the kernel of knowledge. It's very easy for them to slot in the pieces of information that you're saying, and that builds the framework about how they should understand the problem, how they should solve the problem. when they start to get countering pieces of information come in, it's more doubtful and cynical than as opposed to, oh yeah, that's reinforcing it. And if it does reinforce what the original responder says, then all it's doing is saying, yes, that person was right. It's not saying, oh yes, this is now where I want to be, the path that I'm moving in. It's a fascinating component for me, the way that the speed to lead actually leverages off the way that we learn.
It's so true, and it actually becomes one of the first books I read in this space that became the catalyst was Robert Cialdini's influence book, and he talks about the levers of influence, and in that scenario, your competitors became your social proof.
Correct. Absolutely correct. That's exactly
And
right.
it's such an interesting pathway to kind of organize, and if you can orchestrate that by responding first, you will have a higher chance. And we know the stats, right? Very few people will actually outreach individually to create an inbound because one, we've trained them not to do so. So it's no longer a organization communicating to their customers. There's behavior learnings that the customers are doing to circumvent the game that potentially, or kind of the environment that the seller has provided. So it's bilateral now. And two, since they know that risk of I know I'm going to get calls, I know I'm going to get and there's going to be a bombardment of information that's going to come at me. For them to take that risk in 2024, that's a really, really high opportunity right there, because those organizations are going to do this lightly. And the buyers and the procurement team are going to say, yeah, sure, send me, 5 members that I can go investigate. So I would dare say even that if you're getting those kind of inbounds today and you're not responding to them within, 6 to 24 hours, you're kind of saying, I don't really want the sale, transparently.
I'm gonna shock you. If you say 6 to 24 hours, the impact of the difference in responding in minutes, individual minutes to 5 minutes, is like 50%. And the chances of actually being able to connect with an inbound prospect that's placed an inquiry decreases at an exponential rate after the first few minutes. And this is why we have these SDR teams that follow up and follow up and follow up and almost become annoying, because individuals then have distracted and moved on, or somebody else has replied and they've taken that path of conversation rather than your own. And our
Yeah.
clients have told us point blank that the difference now between having a conversation live on the website as the prospect is doing their research and getting it to a point where you've satisfied their thirst for knowledge and proven that there's a potential to solve their problem, then qualified them to make sure that they're actually a potential fit for the organization, and book them to a meeting with an account executive. So you're taking out all of these loops and steps of follow-up along the way, has been so effective. It's shortened their sales cycles. It's gone through the whole, removed a whole lot of effort and cost from the business in terms of SDRs having to follow up. And it's increased their conversion rates. It varies. It depends on the quality of the traffic. But in most cases, it's more than doubled the conversion rates from the website, which has all those other flow-ons. It builds their pipeline, it reduces client acquisition costs and everything.
No.
But the impact of speed to lead now, from what we're seeing, is actually measured in minutes. You mentioned before the game. I think it is a game. Prospects and buyers that have got problems do everything they can to avoid being identified by the organisations or potential organisations that they're researching. We've got this dark social or dark funnel where they're using their own peers and their own networks to try and research and find possible solutions and viable suppliers. Is so much more in the fore now. I mean, it's been spoken a bit about over the last couple of years, but we're seeing ourselves that it's the clients that we're dealing with are reducing their amount of advertising because they're finding that they're just not getting the return. So advertising budgets are being reduced as the cost per click and the cost per impressions is just increasing on a constant basis. and then people are not identifying themselves when they come through to the website.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole other debacle. I think to that game that I mentioned. Um, I think at this point, I have to remember. I recall it was around 50% of our existing clients. We recommended either a reduction of ad because the cost per customer acquisition is just not worth it anymore compared to the lifetime value, or the quality of them is just too high. Because to your point, um, if the buyer and seller is this cat and mouse, what has become unfortunately is this cat and mouse model. Well, the mouse knows, all the traps and so on. They've gotten used to those areas, and the things that maybe have traditionally worked don't. So in many instances, we recommended to take more of an organic approach to getting those modeled or doing a different type of outreach that doesn't put it at the forefront. So we're looking at AI more from a search answer model versus a search
Yep.
engine model. Some of those elements to kind of bolster it a bit better, but to your point, it's becoming unsustainable for a lot of companies and a lot of those that have, you spend so much on the front end for when you measure an attribution model or an impact analysis, as we do here at BMG. You realize that actually the majority of those leads are using your advertising to kind of double check, but it's not the initial net. So if it's not the initial net, why would it matter if you can use other channels that are significantly less costly? So I think it's going to be an interesting 2025 planning. Uh, we're in Q4, so everyone's in planning for next year around where their budgets are going to lie. But this quarter specifically, we've actually made recommendations to say we either recommend you permanently turn it off, and here's a couple other channels to take into consideration that would probably suit better, or we've asked for a reduction and then reallocate those funds into content or events or some other vehicle of communication, just due to the fact that their particular buyers are so um, inundated with advertising. And
Mm.
I'm more thinking around the digital advertising space online, not necessarily CTV or
Correct.
the OOH models. Those are still newer and probably require more investigation.
Yep.
But it's just the traditional SEM kind of models seem to be where
Yep.
the most of that wastage comes in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, it's fascinating, but we're still seeing some clients using things like billboards, hard media, signage, that type of thing. I think because of the differential in cost, it's a little bit harder to track because you can't allocate a pixel, you can't measure the clicks. But they're seeing a better return on investment from the media buys as opposed to the SEM at the moment. What do you think? And I've seen a little bit over the last 24 months seems to be a bit of a rise of community organisations actually building community. What's your thoughts on that
Um,
as a
you know,
channel? Sorry. Yeah.
yeah, it's so interesting because I was just discussing with a colleague of mine actually around we've gone from searching engines to searching AI, and that still doesn't cover because obviously Chat, GPT, and Copilot, and Gemini, and all these other systems don't necessarily have all of the web intelligence at this time, or have limited aspects. We'll see how that changes. But the secondary notion has been, let me go ask my peer, especially if you're in the C-suite, and that's who your buyer is. The the recommendations, and I'm in a couple of coffee talks and communities myself with entrepreneurs and CMOs. The amount of, has anyone heard of this company? What do you think of them? Or I'm looking for this particular solution. Does anyone have any recommendations? is probably one of the highest talking points in those. And it's Slack channels, it's forward sessions in a new app, what have you. That is a really big one. And I think we're gonna start to see that. Um, and I think that comes from an anthropological level. You start to not necessarily trust the systems like search engines or going onto companies' websites, and then you go back to like the second thing you trust most, which is your peers. Um, I know when I have a particular problem, I will go to my peers because there's so much information, and we're at this level of cognitive overload at this point that sometimes even if it's not the best answer, it gives me a direction. Even if my peer has never experienced that particular problem, just having that sounding board has become so much more important. And we've done study after study around how lonely it is at the top when you're a C-suite, and having that tribe to go to and say, hey, I've got this other problem. I think we're entering a phase of kind of leaning back to our anthropological, like we need a village kind of models. Because the digital space is wonderful in that early stage, but it doesn't talk back to you, and it doesn't give you insight, and it doesn't empathize with you or any of those things that are just so inherently human that I think we're needing. And I think COVID actually accelerated that because we saw that in the early stages, and then we kind of went 10 years into the future and into that type of necessity.
I agree. I agree entirely. I believe that if you think about where do you go and what do you do when you're going to research about something, the first thing you do is go and have a look at the reviews. Normally, you would just go and look at the reviews. And in the past, that has been an amazing source of credibility and trust. But then you have organizations like G2 and Capterra, who we find now, they're bought reviews, they're paid reviews. And I can speak from personal experience where we had our organization on G2, and they suggested we run a campaign across our clients to gain reviews and offer a small incentive. It wasn't much, a $25 Visa voucher, these types of things, just to actually get them to respond. And then I started to see all of these reviews pop up that weren't from our clients. They were people that I had no idea. They'd never worked in any of our clients. They'd never worked with us. Obviously, from the comments, had no idea about what we actually did. When I went back and questioned it, it turns out, G2, we just send it out broader through our network for other people that might have used your product. Well, we've got a pretty tight-knit, family of clients here in our business. And that was, honestly, and maybe my naivety was a shock to me. And that happened about 4 years ago. And when I realized what was doing, that made me then look across the other businesses. Aside from that, look at what's happened through, say, Amazon stores and the proliferation of, buy 10,000 reviews to make your business look credible. I think, people have just got to this stage of that once used to be that once trusted resource of, reviews. It's just not trusted anymore. And I think that's accelerated this whole, okay, well, I need to find somewhere else that I can get some feedback and trust. And I think that's having a huge impact on the growth of communities.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Again, we go back to that gaming model, right? We've kind of gamified how reviews go, and now they for better or worse, some of it is easier to get reviews, and some of it is not reliable anymore. So the general population is, well, that's not a reliable source of information, so I have to go elsewhere. And when you have a limited number of those, that becomes difficult. I know that's a similar pattern of some NPS scores, incentivizing NPS scores for your customers. Well,
Yep.
the ones that like you are going to be more likely to respond because now you've just given them a space around it. And that is probably the biggest ahas that we have when we do the program of, oh, I didn't realize that if we paid people, I'm like, well, yeah, because it's a human nature thing. Oh, okay. Let me go through it. Very few people who are upset with you are going to, potentially want that $25 gift card. Because they've already disassociated with you. So now you have quieter negative responses and louder positive responses, which is going to give you a completely skewed analysis of how your customers treat you. And then you wonder why your 7 to 8. This is another one that we always kind of do around is if you're doing a 10-point scale in your NPS scores, your 7 and your 8s are your deadliest numbers.
Yeah.
And often that's the
Interesting.
biggest bulk of clients.
Why is that?
Because we've trained our customers to say, if you give me anything lower than a 7, I'm going to give you a call. If you've given me anything higher than a 9 or a 10, I'm going to ask you for a review. Nobody does anything with 7s.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like silent majority, so to speak. And we actually remove, we say you should not have any ambiguity. If you're going to do it, you should do an even scale. So 4-point scale is kind of our recommended. If they're going to give you a 2, that means you're in the middle, but you're still subpar. If you're going to give you a 3, you're in the middle, but you're still higher.
Yeah.
And what happens when people do 5 scales? Well, everybody picks a 3, or the 4s and 5s get grouped together, but 4s and 5s are inherently different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Interesting. I think it was Todd Capone who wrote the transparency sale, who spoke about the importance of, the impact of review ratings when they're being publicised. Nobody believes a 5-star review. Nobody believes a 5-star review. Sure, you may get 1 or 2 5-star reviews, but if your overall rating is 5 stars, then that's less believable than a 4.3 to a 4.7. It's the same sort of idea where I think that when people are looking at it from the outside, you've got hundreds or thousands of reviews and it's 5-star, and that can't be right. Nobody ever is 100% happy. And we know that you can't keep all the people happy all the time. So it was interesting. And it's almost plays into the fact that it's not doing you as an organisation any benefit in those 7s or 8s. It doesn't give you any insight, so to speak. And I mean, look, aside from vanity metrics, the main idea of Net Promoter Scores or any of these review type scores, I guess in my perspective, particularly with the Net Promoter Scores, because you do get some feedback there in terms of what's working, what's not working. It gives you the insights to be able to go and improve your business, find out where you're not performing as well as you should be. 7 and 8 don't give you enough incentive to do that, really.
And there's different strategies for, if you do a 4-point scale, you know exactly where your customers stand. That's kind of the beauty. There is no ambiguity into some kind of middle ground. And then you have different strategies for each one. If you want to take your 1s actually can go to 5, to 4 way faster than your 3s. Because your 1 cared enough about you to tell you that they're unhappy. Mm-hmm. This is your opportunity to fix it. And that means that they're not, there's no apathy there if they've given you a 1. They definitely have a feeling. It may not be one that you like, but they at least feel something, which is much easier to move than complete apathy, which is a no response in many of those instances. I think that there's this element when it comes to, and Net Promoter, to your point around vanity scores. But what happens when you go, like, even, I'm looking for a restaurant. I look at the reviews. What's the first thing you do? You read all the 1. You want to see what the 1s say. Does it have cockroaches? Damn, that's out. That's what I'm going to do. And then I look at the 4, and then I move my way up. I want to know what the bad is first. And everybody has a slightly different pattern, but they go into individual ones. Because to your point, if you see a ton of 5s and there's no comments, that's a massive red flag to say, These are probably not real. There might be some kind of thing going on to it. So again, we've trained our customers to behave a certain way in response to the game that we put afoot.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I do exactly the same. If I'm researching something, particularly if it's a restaurant, I will go to the 1s and the 2s very first off. And in my mind, there's only 2 types of reviews that you get in a 1. It's either a dissatisfied customer or it's a competitor. That seems to be the place. It's simple. I think you mentioned it's easier to get someone from a 1 to a 4. The opportunity to resolve a problem or to make an improvement has such a huge impact on an individual when you show that you care, that you have that level of you show them that you value them so much that you've taken their feedback, you're interacting directly, and you're making specific improvements that impact them based on their feedback. The dopamine hit that gives individuals is just immeasurable. Is that why you consider it gets from a 1 to 4?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because they cared enough to vocal it, and if you've done something about it, then there's this reciprocity of like, okay, well, I did something, and now they fixed it. So even as renewal time comes up, you've shown effort around repairing it, so you have a much higher chance of getting that customer to stay with you because you cared enough to address their problems and really work through that process. I remember one of the very first projects that was in the customer intelligence space that we did was right before COVID. We had done an NPS analysis from a perception standpoint, and really kind of saying we would like to dig deeper into 7s and 8s because that's the model that you currently use, and go through it. And I remember the conversation being, well, they gave us 7, so they should be happy enough. And then COVID hit. And the very first set of customers that left were not the 1 through 6s. It was the 7s and 8s.
Wow, that's
Because
interesting, isn't it?
they left in droves. And this is one of the things I always talk about, especially if you're entering like uncertain times economically or from a market perspective. The ones that you should worry about are the silent ones, because the vocal ones will at least care enough to tell you to your face. The silent ones are always the ones that are just going to say, great, I've got another one. And if you are a newbie in that space, that's who you go after. If you're a new competitor in that space, that's who you go after. You go after the 7, because they don't care enough to respond to their existing partners and haven't built a strong enough relationship to tell them what's going on.
That's really interesting. The utopia is to be proactive as an organization, but the reality is you're never going to find all of the things that people aren't happy about. And in fact, that being proactive is that listening component and looking for where the opportunities to improve are.
Absolutely. I think that proactivity of let me at least understand, because I think it's one thing for you to lose a customer and not know it, and kind of be taken off guard, and then lose another one for the same reason and not know it. That repetitive pattern. When you have a massive leak like that, it's an entirely different one where you have done everything you can, and you've said maybe this customer isn't ideal for us because what they're demanding is not what we necessarily offer.
Right.
2 different conversations there.
Yeah.
And you can for the latter. So.
And you can make that decision, but that's absolutely a true scenario. If it's at the point where what you're doing, what you're providing is not ever going to solve the problem for that client, then it's a disaster waiting to happen. You're better off making the decision and parting company. I'm feeling like I've used examples of our clients a couple of times now, but we've got one client in particular who reads every single chat transcript from start to finish. And they've got a team dedicated to do that. We're helping as well, but using AI for that now to go through and pull out the insights. But the fascinating thing for me was that I knew anecdotally that there's gold in the chat transcripts. They have physically built it into part of their strategy, and they use it to uncover new product features. Questions that are being asked in the chat, does it do this, does it not do that? They track every single feature request or question through the chat. They also track all of the support type questions where there's a difficulty or a challenge or someone is not, maybe a user interface issue. They track all of those to help with their UI design. They also track and review all of the discussions. And so what I'm talking about here is these are the conversations that there's been no identification of who the individual is that we're talking to. And so, yep, sure, there's the leads that convert. We've got contact details for that. Yes, there's the customer support inquiries. We've got contact details for that. I'm talking about the gold in what is usually the unmined conversations. And so it from time to time, there'll be people that will step in and have a concern about something, but don't want to take it any further. And they use that as well. Then they're using it in a couple of places. So obviously about their product features, the user interface, and then their own customer support. But they're also starting to take all of that information now, feed it into something like Claude or ChatGPT, and use that to generate content for their marketing team. So they're actually talking about the things that the people that are interested in their product are talking about. It's been a real eye opener for me in terms of the total value. I mean, we charge for the leads, but they're extracting so much value from overall conversations that you should be charging more.
So interesting. I had a conversation with a colleague of mine, and he worked for at the time he worked for a really large tech company in the customer experience division, and we talked about how just anecdotal and in like those anecdotes can be key, because if you can kind of surmise them and synthesize them in a way that gives you information, you can feed it to sales, you can feed it to marketing, you can feed it to product. And that's what I mean by it become a bilateral feeding service between buyer and seller, because now you have, it's not just the company, the seller that is pushing information over. We've kind of created this hopefully nutritious cycle with it, and I think that the more, especially business owners, start to see that there is a cycle to this information, and it's a dialogue as opposed to a handoff. The much more proactive mindsets, I think a lot of CEOs are gonna see it as. In fact, before starting BMT, I worked for an organization where I built the whole customer intelligence department that was different than the business intelligence department, because the analysts in that element didn't necessarily care about sentiment. They cared about forecasting, they cared about numbers, so on. The customer intelligence department almost solely worked on program for active clients or campaigns to generate for future clients.
And where was that information coming from? Where were they drawing their data from?
Past clients and existing clients throughout it. So we kind of drew it from, here's the programs that we ran, here's the programs that we've proposed, and then even their win-loss ratios of what kind of data did they give us when they decided to either change out the entire program, because it was much more of a bidding environment where you would place a bid around, here's my proposal. It's more of a creative environment that this organization ran off of. And then we would say, well, how many times have we proposed Croatia, for example, because it was more of a travel agency that was operated off of. How many times have we proposed this other location? Even as simple as changing locations made a big difference in our win rate. To say, if you pick a new place that they haven't been to, that their perception of that place is interesting, you're going to get better buy-in from a planning perspective.
Stay tuned for part 2 of the chat with Ellza.